This 6.0 Powerstroke turbo is Ford F250 and F350 6.0. You really need to pay attention because some 6.0 Powerstroke rebuild kits are not the same thing. The cab and chassis models had a smaller version in which the bearings, bearing housing, the turbine housing was all different. This is for the GT37 VAS. You'll find the part number sticker right here, but this one's gone. They usually fall off. The GT37 VAS is the bigger one. This bearing housing right here, I've already torn it down. I've sandblasted it. I've pressure washed it. I cleaned it really well. The way I clean this is you'll have holes all throughout this thing that need to have brushes going through them with soap and water. Get you some really good brushes. I got mine from Harbor Freight. Go through all the threads. I go through all the feed holes because there's a hole right here on the other side and right here that need to be cleaned. Most of the holes are where this VGT solenoid is. So you see that one plug there, you got to clean that really well. There's an oil feed hole down there in the back side. And then there's another feed hole too. And then there's a drain hole. There's a drain hole that goes to the center of the bearing housing to drain the excess oil out. And then there's two other lubrication, I guess, drain holes. That actually all three of these, or all four of those, might be drain holes. Anyway, just make sure you brush every single hole in this thing, even the threads. And then I ran a brush down the center of that hole, the feed hole for the journal bearings. You have these a drain hole going through there, a drain hole going through there that drains out of this plunger area. There's likely that's blocking off a hole too. And then run brushes through these holes and then through this hole, and make sure you clean as much carbon out of this area as you can. This piece is removable. It actually presses out this way, but if you do that, putting it back in the same spot is a little bit hard. You probably should make a custom tool to get it so it'd press back in the same spot if you want to remove that. This little piece right here is a little like stainless steel. It's kind of like a seal, and it compresses against the bearing housing, and it just kind of keeps the exhaust out of the area, and the oil is on this side and exhaust is this side. So that little VGT arm runs through that thing. It can have a bunch of oil that builds up in the back side of this thing and stuff. So we cleaned all that out. That bushing right there presses down out if you want to remove it. I just choose not to because it's hard to get it back in the same spot. And I don't have a replacement for this piece right now, so I prefer not to have to replace that or to remove that part. The first thing I'm going to do is insert the VGT arm and the gear and the little pin here. Make sure all these things are super clean. I cleaned through every hole with little brushes. This is a dental brush that you can get at your local store. I got this at Walmart, and there's different sizes, so they work great for this kind of thing. I cleaned it up with like gasoline is what I chose to use, but you can use carb cleaner. And just make sure all the carbon's off of it so it's going to operate properly for many, many miles ahead. Take this and put it through the back side. And also pay attention here because you have one side that's made to get the cotter pin in easier. So get that in the right position. You're going to punch the cotter pin in on the top. Then we'll drop this in. This pin will now go in here and we'll tap the pin in. Removing the pin, you'll need to grind down a punch like this so that you can punch the pin all the way out. I'm just going to go ahead and put this in. I can't really show you because it's hard to film it at the same time as me doing it because I just don't have enough hands. There's a plug that normally sits here. You have to remove that plug to access removal and installation of these three pieces. When you're happy with how you got that in there, we can move on to the next step. I push the cotter pin in and I try to center it up best I could on both sides. When you're pressing or punching the pin in, this is the position that the VGT arm is supposed to be to make that hole center up there so you can press it in. And then the gear is in like a position like this. Oil this O-ring first. So the O-ring's in there. I'll show you where the O-ring is. It sits this down, the second groove down, because we have to put our C-clip in. Next part is putting our plunger in, this piece. Some of them have these seals and some of them don't have these seals, so if yours doesn't have them, it's probably not a big deal. Some of them were made without seal grooves at all. Just going to oil that up and then put that inside here and line the gear up. We're going to catch the first gear when we push this in. You can see really closely how we caught onto that first gear, and then we can rotate it properly back and forth. Make sure that your VGT arm goes all the way around after you install it, because if you mess that up, if you're hammering on this thing and it's not going in there, sometimes you can bend that VGT arm, so you got to be kind of careful with that. The way to put this in is just oil it and massage it in. I realized later on, because I made a video about this a really long time ago, is that when I hammered those in there, it tears the O-ring. So don't hammer it in there, just work it in with a pair of pliers. You could also file on this edge if you felt like it's too sharp. There's different versions of this cap, so you need to make sure you keep all the original parts with the original turbo. Some caps are deeper, and I think it has to do with different versions of this gear or something, or it may even be the bearing housing related, I'm not sure, but keep all the original parts with the same turbo. And just work it in like that. And it just slides right in without tearing the O-ring. It also helps if you oil that O-ring properly, like I showed before. I'm going to put this clip in. One of my employees bought these pliers. He got them on Amazon. I'll link to those below. These work pretty good. Sometimes I have to trim on the tips a little bit, depending on what I'm putting together. The best way to get this in is just get it hooked in the holes first and then hold it down so that it can't escape. And then compress. And it went right in. And you could rotate it wherever you want that to be, which I don't think it really matters, but we can move it if we need to. So I'll put it here at the top. And just make sure it's fully secured, which it looks like it's good. You can always pry on it. Put this plug in. This will prevent the plunger from coming out. So right now, even though we have all this together, we could take that gear on the other end, push the plunger, and the plunger gear can run off of this gear that we just put together. So if we did that, we'd have to take all that back apart. But once we put this in, then we don't have to worry about this coming apart because the plunger bottoms out on this little plug right here. I put a new seal on it, which is part of our rebuild kit. If you're removing this, you thread in a 6mm by 1.0 bolt and then just take a pair of pliers and work it out. So a C-clip that holds that in, so that has to be removed, which is this piece first before you use the bolt trick to pull this out. Plunger's down in there. I put some oil down in there, and I'm going to insert our plug. I oiled up the O-ring too, so it's going to slide in there without getting damaged. I would recommend avoiding using a hammer to push this in there because you're likely to damage that O-ring, and you don't want this leaking after you've already put it on the truck. I'll put the rounded side on the outside. little plug is a little bit too far in, so I'm just going to try to pull it out some. It's impossible for it to come out now, so this is working properly. I'm going to put this plug back in. It's a 5/16 Allen. I put silicone black RTV all the way around it, but below about one thread, so it doesn't seep into the bearing housing. When you remove your plug, it will have red silicone already on it. You possibly could just remove it, clean it, and reinsert it and be okay because it's a pipe thread fitting. I've just always brushed off the old silicone and put new stuff on there. That way we don't have to worry about it. You're supposed to wait, I think, 24 hours before you run it, but because I always ship turbos, then it really doesn't matter to me, because by the time the customer receives it, it'd been like a couple days. I'm going to put all the seals on my actuator here. This part right here moves up and down. I always clean that by wire brushing all the carbon off of it and burnt oil first. Then I'll push it down and spray some carb cleaner in there to try to get it flowing out of these areas here. And then I'll also flush it down through here, back each way, and try to get as much old oil out of it as possible. You don't want any debris in this thing because it goes right above the top of the turbo. And a lot of these have little screens. I think it's right there. So the screen prevents debris from going from here to the bearings. This one didn't even have one in there. Some just don't have them in there, or either they were removed before. But I'm just going to put it back without it. In some ways the screens are good, but like on the Subaru models, with the Subaru turbos, the screens and the heads always clogged up with old oil and then just destroyed the turbo. So a lot of people remove the screens out of those models. But it hasn't been such an issue on these, at least I haven't seen that. I'm just putting all these O-rings on this actuator here that are part of the rebuild kit that we have. Clean them really well with microfiber cloth just in case. Just re-inspect everything. It's super clean before it goes in. We can air it off too. I'm going to put some new oil on there to make it so it goes in easy. Plate on, put our bolt there, and torque that down to 18 foot-pounds. These bolts are a 8mm by 1.25, so you can look up the torque specs if you want to, or you could just go off the 18. I think it's like 17 to 21 or something. I'm going to put the front of this together. So here's my collar and spacer. This is my spacer, and this is the collar. I checked these over to make sure we don't have any burrs here. That's going to, no raised edges or anything. That's going to make it lock up. Backside isn't as big of a deal on this one. This one, I'm checking the outside edges to make sure there's no burrs and no raised edges or burrs on this. So now we're happy with the way it looks. We can put them in. So there's the flat washer, oil on that. I've already cleaned all these pieces. I'm checking to make sure there's no burrs on this too. No burrs on the edges, raised edges or anything. I cleaned this up and cleaned all the holes and everything. It's ready to install. You need this copper bar one over the steel one. The steel ones will not hold up as well as the copper ones. If you're rebuilding one and you notice your steel one's messed up, that's most likely the reason why you're having to do a rebuild. These copper ones are less likely to have problems. The only time they can really have problems if they don't get oil at all on them. The steel ones, they don't dissipate the heat well, and they could cause a bunch of issues because of that and cause it to wear out faster and overheating inside the turbo. To put on the front piston ring, this one's a staggered one. Just put the open end over top and then slide it on the back so it goes in like that. I'm going to air that off in case any debris came off when I put that on there. You can take your little dental brushes through all the individual holes. It's a good idea to do that for us at least because we balance these, and when we do that the metal goes everywhere so it can get all inside the holes and stuff. So I'm going to do that now. Don't oil it. And this is clean, we're happy with it. We can oil that up. I always like to keep the gap at the top of the turbo. This end is cut for the plunger area, and this has clearance for that. Now we can bolt this down. I put some red thread locker on them. They're a 8mm by 1.25 bolt. These get torqued down to 18 foot-pounds. We need to make sure we put the rear seal on. I went ahead and polished the shaft just in case there's anything stuck to it. I got it off there. And check to make sure it doesn't have any burrs or anything. Put the opening on first. Just like that. And I'm going to air that off again. Putting it on, making sure that it's not gritty or anything. The spacer, other bearing. Alright, it's not gritty at all. My hands are clean, and we can get ready to put it inside the bearing housing. This bearing housing, I did have to repair that. It's always wise to put the rear seal in the back of the bearing housing to check to make sure that it's not going to leak. You're checking your gaps. The Powerstroke 6.0 has always been the biggest gap. Sometimes I've got like 14 on that. It seems like the staggered rear seal fixes that though. I put my heat shield back. I had to use new hardware because all that stuff got damaged when the turbine broke on the last turbo. Pay attention to your bearing heights here. It should be slightly below the top of that shaft area, that level. There's different spacers and bearing widths. They should all match with the rebuild kit. So sometimes the spacer could be smaller and the bearings wider. Put some blue thread locker on here. That's for aluminum, so I put a little bit right there. Now I'm just going to give it a quarter turn. I snugged it up.